Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to be here to tell you about the work that's been going on, starting actually back when I was a graduate student with Bart Hobel at Princeton University. And so this goes back quite a bit, where we've been trying to understand this very question of what is going on with the obesity epidemic, and how might this concept of food addiction play into that. So what I want to talk about today is really sort of just start off by outlining this problem of obesity, which is, I think, one of the main reasons why we're all here today. I want to talk about some of the factors that are thought to contribute to the rise in the obesity epidemic. I then want to spend a little bit of time talking about the background on food reward and some of the select associated brain systems that are associated with it. Then I want to spend some time talking about defining addiction. Addiction is a term we tend to throw around pretty liberally, and I think that we've now come to a consensus in terms of how we might define that from a scientific standpoint. I want to talk about some of the work that's been going on in my laboratory, as well as some others, where we've begun to characterize food addiction using laboratory animal models. So I want to walk you through some of our empirical data to support this concept. And then if we have time, I'd like to spend some time talking about some of the sort of points for further discussion about where do we go from here. If food is addictive, or some foods are addictive or have addictive qualities, what might that mean, and what are some of the issues that surround it? So as you all know, we're facing this crisis in our country and in many other parts of the world regarding obesity. We're finding that the majority of the population is now overweight. And so in addition to the comorbid health concerns associated with obesity, such as heart disease and diabetes, there's also significant psychological, economical, and social consequences associated with it. Overall well-being is diminished when people are overweight or obese. And there's also a significant cost in terms of paying for health care associated with it. So the question is, why are so many people overweight and obese? Despite all the education, all the warnings out there, why are people having a hard time regulating their body weight? Well, there's many factors. One is the fact that we've seen an increase in portion size, or portion creep, over the years. This cartoon shows that back in the 50s, our typical sizes of some of these things were relatively small compared to what we see now. Also, food acquisition is a bit easier than it used to be. If you can think back to what our ancestors might have looked like if we evolved from hunters and gatherers, we used to have to work pretty darn hard to get food. We had to go out in the field and find berries or find an animal and really work to get that food. But that's changed a little bit. These days, fortunately for many of us, food is relatively easily accessible and it's relatively cheap. But that does mean that it's changed the way in which we acquire it. So I want to make the point that obesity is an endpoint. We're not going to identify one singular cause of obesity. Obesity is an endpoint that's a result of many different things, including things that I just described, also things like sedentary lifestyle, genetic vulnerability for some, social norms regarding food, stress and endocrine factors certainly play a role, and even some rare genetic disorders such as Prader-Willi syndrome. But the question that I've been interested in for many years now is, how does the taste of food, or the rewarding aspects of food, play into this, and how might this also contribute to some part of the obesity epidemic? So we've been talking a bit, I understand from what I've heard from the discussion yesterday, about how do we define an addiction, and I think we need to also step back and think about, well, how do we define a food? And so here's an example of a food, a common food that many people consume, and does anyone want to take a guess as to what this might be? It's pretty easy if you look at the ingredients. It's a bag of baby carrots. Simple. Now here's another common food that many people consume. And if we take a look at the ingredients, you could see that it's not so obvious what this food is. Anyone know what it is? Pop-Tarts. So you can see that we have differences in the ingredient components of many of the foods that we eat. And I would argue that we need to start thinking about maybe defining what we consider or characterize as a food differently, just like we're thinking about how we might define or characterize what an addiction might be. Also, another thing we need to consider when thinking about defining terms is this whole idea of hunger versus hedonically driven eating. There are multiple reasons why people eat. The primary reason we think people eat is for hunger, but hunger is associated with negative reinforcement. It's taking away something that's bad. Whereas many people consume foods and talk about eating for hedonic purposes, or eating not because they're hungry, but because they derive pleasure out of eating the food or tasting the food. So when I talk about food addiction and when we're talking about some of the data that I'm going to go through today, we're talking about these hedonically driven types of foods, these foods that contain ultra-processed ingredients, lots of added things like sugars and fats, not the bag of baby carrots and not broccoli. We're talking about foods that can be hyperpalatable, and so these are foods that are stimulating multiple systems in the brain that are activating these brain reward systems in a way that could potentially be putting them into overdrive. So this is a very simple diagram of what happens in the brain when we eat. And I'm going to focus in today on some of these pathways because we have some data that I want to show you that helps to illustrate the evidence that we're talking about with respect to food addiction. But the point here is that there are pathways in the brain that reinforce natural behaviors that cause us to engage in them repeatedly, such as sexual behavior and feeding behavior. We need to do those things in order to survive as a species. Well, it turns out that drugs of abuse also work on those pathways. And so there are overlaps in the neural circuitry associated with eating and also with drug abuse and drug use. And so based on all this background, the sort of empirical question that my lab has been asking for many years is, could some people maybe be addicted to eating highly palatable foods that are rich in added sugars and sweets in a way that could resemble a drug addiction? And could this in some way contribute to the obesity epidemic? So the next question is, well, how do we define an addiction? Now, what we've done in my laboratory, and as many others have done in the research, is to use the DSM criteria for substance dependence, which now uses the term addiction in the title in DSM. And I'm not going to spend too much time going over this, because I understand yesterday there was a fair amount of discussion on this topic. But what we've done is to take these criteria, which are shown here, and to really sort of try to characterize whether or not we can see these criteria for addiction when the substance of desire is a highly palatable food. And so what we've done in my laboratory is to adopt many of these different paradigms that have been used to assess addiction to drugs of abuse in animal models, but instead of giving the animals drugs, we're simply giving them delicious foods to eat. Now, one thing I will point out about the DSM criteria is that it's important to note that this bottom part here, that certain classes of drugs, some symptoms are less salient, and in a few instances, not at all symptoms apply. For instance, withdrawal symptoms are not specified for inhalant use disorder. So while these are all criteria associated with addiction, particularly related to substance use, you don't need to meet all of them in order to be diagnosed as having a substance dependence disorder or an addiction. So my lab's a translational research lab. We mostly do animal research. We're more recently doing some clinical work as well. But I just want to point out one of the things that, or the reasons why I'm drawn toward the animal models is because they really have a lot of utility. They allow us to look at physiological characteristics that we wouldn't be able to look at in other ways in human models. We can identify the biological variables associated with specific types of foods in ways in which we could never do with humans due to confounding variables such as social and cultural influence. And it's important to note, we're not modeling obesity, we're not modeling binge eating disorder, we're modeling features of the disorder with the animal models. So we're able to model specific aspects of the disorder by using these animal models. So I want to walk you through some of our data. Now, I don't have time to go through all of it. I want to point to a review paper that's actually a few years old that I wrote at the time in 2008, where we had summarized the research that had been done up to this point, where we had looked at DSM criteria for substance dependence and what research had been done looking at animals who were simply over-consuming sugar. And I'm going to take you through some of these today, but I just want to point out there are several review papers that we've written over the past couple years, some more recent to this, if you're interested in getting the details. So we started off by looking at sugar, and many people will ask, well, why sugar? It's certainly not meant to pick on sugar. There's reasons for it. If we look at the amount of sugar that people are consuming, we see that the average American is consuming 22 added teaspoons of sugar a day. And so that's much more than the World Health recommendation now states. And sugar seems to be one of the ingredients that people find to be particularly problematic. When they're trying to cut back on their intake, they find that it's very difficult to regulate their intake of foods that are rich in added sugars and carbohydrates. There's also been a lot of discussion about this correlation between amounts of sugar in our diet and the rise in the obesity epidemic. So we're trying to be careful scientists. It seemed like a good place to start by starting with a single nutrient that people seem to have a hard time regulating their intake of. So we developed an animal model in which we simply give rats, your standard run-of-the-mill rat, access to their rat food, they also get optional access to a sugar solution. So they can drink sugar, or they can ignore it if they don't want to drink it, and they can just drink their water. We do this for about a month, and what we find is that rats that are over-consuming the sugar or that are binging on it will develop this pattern that looks a little bit like tolerance. They'll start to drink more and more and more sugar over the course of each day, over approximately a month. Interestingly, we have a group of rats that don't overconsume sugar. So these are animals that are given sugar ad libitum. And these animals don't show this escalation in daily intake. They seem to asymptote their intake. It's only the rats that seem to be binging on it that are showing this increased intake over time. When we look at the first hour of intake, which we've defined as the binge period, you can see here, if we look at how much the rats are consuming on day 1 and day 21, you see a much larger meal during the first hour of access. And we don't see this in animals that are binging or who have limited daily access to just their rat food. Here we see this on the bottom. They eat about the same on day 1 as on day 21. So there's something special about the sugar that's causing these animals to overeat it and also to show evidence of binging behavior on it. Now, I'm a neuroscientist, I'm interested in the brain. One of the hallmarks of drugs of abuse is that they release dopamine every time they're administered, be it cocaine, alcohol, nicotine, morphine. They release dopamine in reward-related regions such as the nucleus accumbens. Now, food can also release dopamine, especially if it's a novel food. But normally what typically happens with food is the release of dopamine wanes as the food becomes more habituated. So as we become more familiar with eating cheese fries, the dopamine release becomes less and less. And so the question that we had in the lab was, well, what's going to happen if we give rats sugar to overconsume? If they're overconsuming it, are they going to release dopamine in a way that's more like a drug, which would mean every single time, or more like what happens with a food, which would mean that the dopamine release would attenuate? And what we find is that indeed, when these animals are drinking sugar solutions, we're finding that the animals that are over-consuming it, when they get access to it, release dopamine. And this continues every time they get access to it. So day 2, day 21 of access, they're continuing to repeatedly release dopamine in response to drinking the sugar. We're not seeing this happening in animals that occasionally drink sugar, and we're also not seeing this in rats that are not overeating sugar, that are just eating it to a smaller degree. Also, we look at animals that are eating just standard healthy food, healthy rat food, and these animals aren't showing this repeated release of dopamine. So again, there's something special about the sugar when it's overconsumed that's causing these animals to release dopamine in a manner that's more like what we'd see with a drug and less like what we'd expect to see with a food. We've also seen signs of withdrawal, and this is something that we can measure in the laboratory by looking for physiological changes, signs of anxiety. When we have animals that are over-consuming sugar and we take the sugar away, or we give them an opioid antagonist, which blocks opioid receptors in the brain, we see signs of distress and anxiety emerge. These animals will spend less time exploring this elevated arm of a plus maze, which is indicative of an anxiety state. And we also see that these animals will show somatic signs of distress. When we look at the brains of these animals, we see that during withdrawal, when we take the sugar away, these animals will show a decrease in dopamine levels coupled with an increase in another neurotransmitter called acetylcholine in reward-related regions. And this imbalance between dopamine and acetylcholine is something that's been shown across withdrawal from many different drugs of abuse, such as cocaine, nicotine, and morphine. So again, this is another similar pattern to what we'd see with a drug of abuse, and not what we typically see when we just take away a desired food. We've also tried to assess craving. Now, I'll point out that craving is somewhat difficult to assess with animal models because craving, I think, is a very human and unique characteristic. But there are things that we can do to determine whether or not a rat would do something that's kind of crazy in order to get access to a food. And so this I actually borrowed from Mary Baggiano, a colleague. She gave rats who are prone to binge eating or resistant to binge eating access to M&Ms. The only catch was that in order to get the M&Ms, they had to be willing to cross an electrified shock grid. And you can see here that the rats that are prone to binge eating are more willing to cross an electrified shock grid to get access to an M&M. And I think you'll agree that it's pretty crazy to cross anything that's electrified, especially if you're a rat and especially if it's just for one little M&M. We've done some work using operant conditioning where we can see how hard rats are willing to work to get access to sugar. And what we find is that rats that are constantly overeating sugar, if they have an abstinence period and then we reintroduce the sugar, they will work harder than ever before, and they will lever press more to get access to the sugar, and they will consume more of it after a period of deprivation. We've also looked at whether or not cross-sensitization between overconsuming sugar and drugs of abuse exists. What we found is that if animals have a history of overeating sugar and then we simply take the sugar away and instead give them a very low dose of amphetamine, which is a potent dopamine agonist, we find that these animals who have been on sugar now, if they're given amphetamine, are very hyperactive in response to it in terms of how much they're running around their cages. Interestingly, when we give the same dose of amphetamine to control groups that either have chow or who have sugar but just aren't over-consuming it, or who have intermittent access to chow, who are sort of binging on chow or binging on something healthy, if you will, these animals don't show this hyperactive response to the amphetamine dose. There's something about the sugar overconsumption, presumably the effect it's having on the dopamine system that I showed you a few minutes ago, that's now causing this dopaminergic agonist to have a behavioral effect in a very low dose. We've also done some work looking at consumatory cross-sensitization. If we have animals that have a history of over-consuming sugar and we simply say, now you have alcohol to drink instead of sugar if you want it, what we find is the rats that have the history of over-consuming sugar are the ones that drink the most alcohol compared to other groups that we've tested. So again, there's something about over-consuming sugar that seems to produce a state in which these animals are now sensitive to the locomotor effects of drugs of abuse and also might show a heightened consumatory cross-sensitization to known drugs of abuse. So we've done a lot of our initial studies looking at sugar, but I don't have time to walk through all the data, but there's been a lot of studies that have now gone on to look at sugar-fat combinations or combinations of other foods. Because as we know, when we have a variety of foods, we tend to eat more. And I think this is important because I think when we're talking about this whole concept of food addiction and the obesity epidemic, it's not because we have one single palatable food that people keep consuming, because if that was the case, sensory-specific satiety would probably put a halt to that. We have a variety of different foods in our food environment that allow us to try different things. When we become satiated to one type of food, we can go on to the other one. And so we've been studying this to a fair extent as well, using something called the cafeteria diet. And this is like what you'd see if you went to any type of sort of restaurant in which they have a buffet. We have a rat buffet, if you will, where we give the rats access to all these delicious types of food. They have a wide variety of high-fat, high-sugar foods. They also have access to healthy foods like bananas and rat food. And what we find is if we have animals on this type of diet, they will become overweight, they will become obese. But something interesting happens when we look at their brains. We decided to give our rats that were overweight on a cafeteria diet amphetamine. And what we found is that the rats that have the cafeteria diet and are overweight will release a lot more dopamine in response to that amphetamine. So being overweight, having this highly sugar, highly fat-rich diet is causing their brains to change so now that they're hyper-responsive to amphetamine, similar to what I just showed you with sugar. Now, when we look at these animals and reintroduce the food, I think this is where it becomes really interesting. Rats that are on a cafeteria-style diet, when we give them the food to consume and we look at their dopamine release, it's interesting, when we look at it, they're not releasing dopamine, even though they're hungry and they should be wanting to release dopamine. Rats that are on a lab chow diet, and we reintroduce lab chow, will certainly release dopamine if we've had them in a food-deprived state, and we see that happening here in the dashed line. What's interesting is it's only when we give the cafeteria diet rats the cafeteria food, or the junk food back, if you will, that we start to see the rise in the levels of dopamine. So it's almost as if in some way their brains have changed as a result of being on this highly variety, highly fat, highly sugar-rich diet that's caused them to now not react to healthy food in the same way that an animal who is on a healthy diet would react in terms of the brain and in terms of dopamine levels. So I think this is really interesting and telling in terms of how chronic access to these types of food can affect our brains, or affect the brains of rats for sure. So I want to move into discussing some of the sort of issues related to this construct of food addiction. And like I said, we've published several empirical studies looking at this, and so I don't have time to go through all the data, but I do encourage you to take a look at some of the review papers if you're interested. What I want to point out is that some people have raised some valid concern, and I agree that we need to really discuss some of these issues, because if we're going to move forward with thinking about this, we really need to, I think, all be on the same page with lots of different things. And so one thing that's come up is this whole idea that the construct of food addiction might be distracting to research. And my colleague, Dr. Rogers, will tell us more, but these are some of the excerpts from some of his writing where he's talked about how it might divert attention from the main causes of overeating and obesity, and instead obesity should be better viewed as due to a toxic environment. And I couldn't agree more that I think toxic environment is certainly a big part of this. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, we've discussed that obesity is an endpoint and has multiple contributing factors. Certainly talking about food addiction does not preclude the legitimacy of any other factors. And so it's important to remember that we're talking about a multifaceted disorder or an endpoint that has multiple contributing factors. And food addiction may be one of them, in addition to the toxic environment in which I think we all agree that we probably are living in. Also, there's been some discussion about how food addiction might be fitting for individuals with binge eating disorder, but how helpful is it for our understanding of obesity? And I think this is a valid criticism because most of the work that has been going on in the laboratory has really aligned food addiction with binge eating disorder. When the animals are binge eating on the food, they seem to show these signs of addiction. And there's been some clinical studies, which I believe Dr. Gerhardt probably discussed yesterday, which talk about the relationship between binge eating disorder and food addiction. But how might this help us understand obesity? Well, one thing that Dr. Rogers has mentioned, and I'm sure he'll discuss in a little bit greater detail in a few minutes, is how this whole idea of the loss of control fits well with binge eating disorder, which allows us to sort of see how food addiction might be related to people with binge eating disorder, but it does not describe well the repeated failure to resist energy-rich foods and that at large portions that gradually contribute to weight gain. And so the idea here is that we don't see that extreme loss of control in obese people. Well, I think, again, this is where we need to kind of revisit what we're thinking about. When we talk about an addict and we think about loss of control, we tend to think about the typical heroin addict or people like this who are down in the dumps, lying in a gutter somewhere with no jobs and no families. But that's not an addict. That's not our typical addict. Our typical addict is the mom driving her kids to soccer practice who's addicted to nicotine, who's smoking cigarettes. So the typical addict in our society is a smoker who is likely a very fully functioning individual, little noticeable intoxication. Withdrawal syndrome is, not physically life-threatening and easily remediated by getting easy access to cigarettes. But because of smoking's health-related complications, it's the #1 cause of preventable death in the United States. And so I believe that addiction to palatable foods, the processed foods that we're talking about today, might be more in line with this type of addiction, this type of loss of control, which might be a little bit more mild and not as well pronounced and not as sort of sensationalized as we tend to think about when we think about the addiction associated with drugs like heroin. Another issue that's come up is whether or not, talking about a food addict, would it confer a stigma? And this has also been something that's been raised with obesity. If we label people as obese, are we hurting them? And this is a very valid concern. And so there actually have been a few studies that have gone on to assess this. And so there's been a few recent studies that have been done to look at whether or not the label of a food addict would confer any stigmatization beyond what's seen with obesity. And it turns out that it doesn't seem to be any worse than what's seen with the label of being labeled as obese. And it certainly was considered as more favorable than being labeled an addict to other types of things such as drugs. There's been another study that's looked at this using vignettes and found that this type of sort of lower perceived psychopathology has been attributed to people that were described as food addicts when being described in these vignettes, regardless of their weight. So again, although we tend to worry that it might confer a stigma, the data so far that we have from these few studies that have been done suggests that that might not actually be the case. So I would like to sort of summarize what I've told you today. This is actually a paper that was written by Manos Pathos a few years ago. And he nicely summarized at that point the DSM-4 criteria for substance dependence and sort of put a check mark next to what they felt had been satisfied by both animal models or humans in terms of empirical studies that had been conducted in the laboratory or in clinical experiments. And as you can see, pretty much all the DSM criteria have seemingly been met when we're talking about addiction where the addictive substance is a food. And the same goes for human studies as well. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and also I'd like to point out I have my contact information here, and also I would like to thank my collaborators, especially Mark Gold, who I'm actually standing in for today. He's unhappy that he was unable to be here today. And also thank my wonderful students and the people who've helped fund the research over the years. Thank you.